Tom Klaus here with Tenacious Change. In the next few minutes, I have the privilege of introducing you to my friend Liz Weaver. Liz is the co-CEO of the Tamarack Institute, based in Waterloo, Canada. She is a thought leader in the realm of collective impact, community change, and she is the author of a number of publications, both trade and academic, on those subjects. She's also a co-catalyst partner with the Collective Impact Forum, and she led the Collective Impact Capacity Building Strategy with the Ontario Trillium Foundation as well. Liz is passionate about a couple of things. One is rugby, right? She loves rugby, but she's also passionate about the power and potential of communities for getting to impact on complex and challenging issues. Prior to her current role at Tamarack, Liz led the Vibrant Communities Canada team and assisted in place-based collaborative groups to develop their frameworks for change and supported and guided their projects from idea to impact. It has also been my honor and pleasure to work with Liz on several occasions, both in Canada and in the United States. Recently, Liz and I co-wrote the closing chapter on a book on collective impact for the Community Development Society. So, I want you to meet Liz. We're going to be talking about community change in the time of COVID-19. I know, not an easy topic, but it's not been an easy time either, right? And one of the things that Liz reminds me in the interview, in our conversation, and I think is going to remind you as well, is that even in difficult times, these are times of opportunity as well. So here we go. Enjoy the interview. Liz Weaver, thanks so much for joining me for this little conversation today. I really, really appreciate it. How are you doing? And perhaps even more importantly, how's your family doing during this time of the pandemic?
Oh, interesting question. I'm doing fine, and my family is doing fine. And my extended family is doing fine because we've been connecting a lot more via Zoom. So, and you know, towards the summer, we were able to see one another, at least those that are Ontario based. So yeah, we're all navigating this together.
Good, good. I'm really glad to hear that. It's such a trying time for anybody and everybody to try to figure out how do you do your work. How do you stay healthy? How do you shelter in place? And how do you stay connected with people as well? So I really appreciate, Liz, that you have taken the time to chat with me today. Some folks that are watching this will know that you and I have been friends for about, 7, 8 years now. I think I met you a long time ago in Cincinnati at the first Collective Impact Champions for Change, if I remember right. And over the years, we have had great conversations together. We've worked together on some projects, and we've done some writing together. So it's really a privilege for me to have this time with you and to introduce you to some of the people that I care deeply about as well, because you're a special person that they need to know. So thank you.
Thanks.
So Liz, you are the co-CEO of the Tamarack Institute, and your focus, though, is really on the Tamarack learning community, if I remember correctly. And in that, you do an awful lot of webinars, an awful lot of training. But your reputation is not just in Canada or even here in the US, it is really global, because your work on community change has really caught the attention of a lot of people around the world. And so before we talk about the challenges that we are facing today in this time of COVID-19, specifically around community change, tell me a little bit about what inspired you to work on community change. How did you get into this business?
That's a great question, Tom. You know, it's people's career paths go in strange and interesting ways. You know, way back, I had a degree, worked on a degree at Carleton University in journalism. So you would think to yourself, well, how does someone who have that kind of a degree, how do they get involved in this kind of work? And, I think I learned early on that I wasn't probably suited to be a journalist, but there were some things that were really helpful in terms of the learning and the courses that I took. And in fact, I started in journalism and ended up in political science. So kind of tells you the change in course during that, even during that time. But, it's interesting because my career has always had in it this common thread of trying to work at the level of community. So, one of my first jobs was at McMaster University in the alumni department. And there I worked with communities of alumni, right? Both geographic and curriculum based. And then from there, I ran a volunteer center, which was very community based. And, just prior to joining Tamarack, I worked at the level of directing a multi-sector collaborative roundtable to tackle poverty. And so, there's always been that thread in my career. And I think more recently, I've really become quite intrigued with what it takes to move systems. And and also really thinking about the challenge that we all face when we're trying to work at this, to not only look inward, to make sure that, the people around the table are engaging in this work, but also to look outward, right? And that comes from, some of the thinking of Rich Harwood in the US, but it is really important not to be so microscopic in your approach that, community change is about getting the community, in my opinion, getting the community to believe that that change is possible. And that really means looking outward, right? And engaging outwardly. And I think we so often focus inwardly on the work, but not on that external expression. And so, yeah, kind of a weird way that I came around it, but it all makes sense.
Right. If I remember right, you were in Hamilton with the roundtable there. Is that correct?
Yeah, with the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction. Yeah.
Right. Very, very good. So, golly, can you imagine that this is October, whatever it is today, and we are now 6 months into this pandemic, and so. We've all been kind of sitting back watching what the pandemic has been doing to our lives and to our work and everything. From where you sit, how has the COVID-19 pandemic been impacting community change work?
Oh, it's interesting. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and thinking about how not knowing what the future holds may make us feel frozen at the moment, right? It's really hard. What I observed in the first kind of 6 months of the pandemic was that people were kind of relaxing into working from home, working remotely, trying to figure it out. They were trying to figure out what this meant for their family lives, if they were, providing schooling to their kids. What did it mean in terms of our relationships with other organizations, all those kinds of things. And so we were kind of settling into this work. And I think, about the end of the summer, I started to think about, okay, so what happens if we pivot, right? What's the next pivot for us? But I'm thinking now that in fact that pivot is maybe only a short-term pivot, right? It might be the next 6 months, it might be the next 8 months or 12 months, and then we'll have a bigger pivot. And so I wrote this piece just recently on the Tamarack website called Frozen. In Canada, pretty soon we will be frozen because it's winter is, just around the corner. But I feel like right now, what I'm observing is that a lot of organizations are frozen, right? They've made that first pivot. They can't see beyond the next 6, 12, 18 months. So they're just kind of frozen right now. And so how do we start to make some decision that might not impact us? We might shift them 3 or 4 times between now and the end of next year, But how do we move from the state of being frozen, right? That state of holding, that state of, being so kind of worried about what the next wave of the pandemic holds that can't forward. Because in fact, there's lots of demands on our organizations, whether we're a service delivery organization, whether we're, like Tamarack intermediary organization, there are these demands, and we have staff that are working for us and with us, and partners that are working with us. And we need to be able to provide some direction. Like I was saying this morning on one of my calls with some colleagues, I said, what would happen if your organization said, for the next 6 months, you will be working from home. So from now until June, we're going to make the decision that you will be working from home. Imagine what that releases then in you as a person that's working for that organization, right? You have this kind of, okay, now I can plan. I know that till next June, I'm going to be in this place, and I'm not going to have to go back to the office. I'm not going to have to navigate that transition. I can spend my energy looking somewhere, improving my conditions in my home office. And I think what I'm observing happening right now is we're going month to month, and sometimes week to week, and sometimes day to day. And yet, if we made some of those smaller scale decisions in this period of time, we would at least get beyond this kind of frozenness that we're in right now.
I actually read your blog about Frozen. Mm-hmm. And I think you've got it right. And it's very similar to what I have been describing to folks right now that I'm working with, a lot of my clients, in part because I want them to let themselves off the hook. Yeah. That they feel like they ought to be doing something and moving and going and somehow returning to normal, whatever normal looks like. And I have been trying to give them permission to go ahead and feel frozen right now. But not for the purpose that they stay frozen, but they acknowledge where they're at. So then they can, to use your term, they can pivot. And I love what you're saying there, Liz, about maybe it's not just a pivot. Maybe it's a series of pivots that we're making. That we're going to pivot for a little while here, then we're going to pivot another direction, then we're going to pivot again. I think that's probably the reality that we're living in right now, because I don't know of anybody out there that's stepping forward and saying, oh, by the way, this is how it's going to be for the next 6 months.
Yeah, I think the best we can do is make the decisions over the things we can control, right? And make some concrete decisions about those things. And then, be agile and adaptive. So that, that by making decisions about things that we can control, like working from home for the next 6 months or till June or whatever that's going to look like, then you have the ability to make some other decisions, right? So what are those things that we can make those decisions around, and then create the space for some of that other kind of shifting and pivot that will naturally happen. Yeah.
Are there some aspects of community change work that you think have been more severely impacted by the pandemic than others?
Oh my goodness. Yeah. I think it's really interesting. I have a paper coming out with some colleagues this week, actually, about leadership. And so, one of the things that we've observed about leadership is that there's kind of 3 forms of leadership that have emerged during this time, right? We've seen responsive leadership, which is really, people stepping into the void and meeting needs really quickly. And then we've seen this kind of density of collaborative leadership, right? So pre-existing collaboratives have become stronger and more impactful, or, there are more pressures being put on them. And if they didn't have good relationships before, that's kind of impacted them negatively. And then there's this kind of third type of leadership that we haven't really landed on a title. We were calling it disruptive, but it's not necessarily always disruptive, and it's emergent, right? And so it's these 3 kinds of leadership that we see expressing themselves over the pandemic. And what we're saying is, in the thesis of this paper, at least the conversation that this paper is trying to evoke is, what does this mean for our work going forward, right? If we want to get to systems change, it's not that one leadership is the be all and end all. In fact, we need all three. And then how do we intentionally leverage all three to get systems change, right? What are the processes around that? So that's one thing I've been thinking about a lot. The other thing I do think is that, it's very interesting to think about how organizations and collaborative tables have been impacted. So the folks on the front line, right? The food banks, the mental health and addictions organizations, the family violence organizations, those kinds of organizations, the literacy and teaching organizations, their demand has gone through the roof, right? They're almost like the Zoom of, the voluntary sector, right? They're seeing demands that are so big, and they've had to really pivot to be both reflective and responsive of community needs. Intermediary organizations or organizations like YMCAs and that are service delivery, but site-specific service delivery organizations, when things have shut down, it's far more difficult for them to pivot into a virtual environment, right? So there's this whole band of organizations in the middle, I think, that have people that would come to their programs and services, and their ability, they're still having to maintain those sites, like YMCAs across Canada and across the United States, but they're not seeing that same kind of interaction. And some of it they can't pivot to remote. Like, you can't run my mother does water aerobics, right? You can't run a water aerobics virtually. You just can't.
It's
so
pretty challenging.
you can do lots of things virtually, can't one water aerobics virtually. So those are things like that whole band, I think, are going to find financial stress. So there's financial stress at the bottom, and that financial stress and service stress is because we don't have enough resources to meet the needs. The financial stress in the middle is that we're supporting infrastructure and no longer getting the resources to support that infrastructure, right? At the top end of it are intermediaries like Tamarack and like other organizations. And I think, we've been able to pivot, but there has been a decrease and then now a ramping up. But as we're ramping up, lots of people in the space are also ramping up, right? And so, we're seeing a short-term blip of people connecting, but is that going to be sustainable? And is that a longer term? So it's just interesting to think about how COVID in our sector particularly has different kinds of repercussions and also different kinds of financial pressures at different levels. And I think, for some organizations that are responsive to government, there are opportunities that are emerging. Do they still have the capacity to deliver what government's expectations are or foundations' expectations are, getting those resources out the door within the timeframes that we're now working, not knowing what the future holds? So there's so much kind of at play right now, right? And if you look at all of that and you go, oh my God, like that's why you're frozen, right? Because like there's so much at play that you could go a million directions, and yet you end up not going any direction.
Yeah. So, I'm back on where you were talking about the three different kinds of leadership. Mm-hmm. And so I had, just before we started this interview, I had finished reading or rereading your paper on collective impact post-pandemic, a framework for response, recovery, and resilience. And as you were describing the first two types of leadership, it struck me that they kind of align with that response and recovery. But what is the leadership that aligns with resilience? And what comes to mind for me is the sense-making leader. I mean, sense-making is always a way of what leaders actually do more than anything else is that they they engage in sense making. That's really what defines leadership, is describing, thinking about what's going on here, describing it to their followers and prescribing how do we move forward. But it seems like in this particular time, in that point where we really need to be resilient, that's where a sense-making form of leadership really becomes very powerful, whether as individuals or as a group, as a collaborative process, that, defining what is it we need to do to move forward in order to be resilient. So I found myself just drifting back there and thinking about that, because I was quite intrigued by that. And, so use that if you like, or just ignore it, whatever you wish.
That's such an interesting point that you would see that, because I wonder if in this new paper that we're co-writing, we're kind of looking at systems, disruptive systems, community change leadership. But I think you're right. I think, maybe what we have done de facto in this other paper is try to make sense of it, right? What are we seeing? What are we making sense of? And I think that, there is this, in this time of kind of disruption that we're all in, I wonder if that sense making, like, you have to make sense before you pivot, right? I think that's such an important thing to say, what just happened in those first 6 months? Now we're going into the next 6 months. So what did we do really well? Where did we miss some opportunities in the last 6 months? Yeah. And if we think about the next chunk is going to be 6 months, what do we do now, right? What are we doing? What has the universe done, right? Or, our key allies, or even some of our competitors, what have they been doing? And then where do we situate ourselves in this kind of next chunk of 6 months? So yeah, you have to actually really focus on sense making before you pivot. Because if you don't, what happens, I think, is that you lose some of those competencies that you've built in this kind of shifting sands that, you didn't necessarily realize that you had, that can be real leverage points for you moving forward. And so so that's really perspective. I do think, I think you're right about that. I think the other part of the resilience piece that I talk about in that paper is to not be overly contained, right? To think about, okay, so what are the simple things that we can agree to? What are the simple rules that comes from human systems dynamics, right? What are the simple rules that we can all agree to for this next short-term pivot, right? Right. So it might be that we're going to continue to communicate often, that we're going to make a decision for the next 6 months and we're going to live with that decision, whatever that looks like. We're going to test this new thing, right? We're going to, continue to do these things and let go of some of these things, right? Like, what are those simple things that you can, get agreement around so that people can relax into what they're doing next? Yeah.
The nice thing about sense making too is because it's a process, it's an iterative process, that we don't have to be absolutely correct. We can be close enough and to get us moving, and understanding that we are always going to be in the process of sense making. Yeah. And I think that takes a burden off of us to get it right the first time. And I love that you said 6 months. I'm thinking, well, maybe we plot out a course for the next 6 days and see.
Yeah. Sometimes it really feels like that. Like, if I can only it's Canada's Thanksgiving next Monday, right? I know that you have a different Thanksgiving in the US, but in Canada, if I can only get to Thanksgiving, right? On Monday. And for you guys, if I can only get to Thanksgiving, which is November for you all, right?
Yeah, right. Well, I just finished a week of staycation, and I just want to say it really didn't work out very well. I think I spent most of the time catching up on stuff that I had to work on. So now I've got my eyes on the American Thanksgiving and saying, okay, if I can just make it to Thanksgiving, I'm actually really going to get a few days off, and that will be really, really nice. Tell me a little bit about what some of the things that you, Tamarack, and perhaps other change makers that you know of that are doing to adapt to the pandemic. Anything come top to mind?
Yeah, so we're pretty fortunate. We've been working remotely for 10 years, right? So that was an easy pivot for us. But, we knew and we learned, even though it was easy, because everybody was already working from home and all that kind of thing, what we learned during that kind of first month and a half around that pivot was that people's response to the pandemic was different. And so we had to be far more kind of intuitive to that and watch what that means and have empathy for that and all that kind of stuff, right? And I think that that's really important. And it's equally been true for this kind of pivot into September, because for people that have children in school, there's a ton of stress, right? That has happened during that time. And so how do we work and support our team in a way that helps them navigate that? So I think there will be these things, right? And, around Christmas, what are the things, and the holidays, what are the things that we have to pay attention to? So there are these markers that we have to pay attention to. I think what we've been able to do, we kind of spent the first couple of months really reflecting on community and how community was responding. Now we're at a place where we're trying to help communities kind of go through these pivot points, right? And really looking at, what are we learning from that? What are the tools and resources that are out there? How do we adapt our thinking to support community change? And in the next month, we're in the middle right now of working on a 10 guide for communities post-pandemic, right? And so we're looking at 10 ideas, 10 stories, and 10 resources. And so these are really reflecting kind of communities that we've worked with over the course of the last couple of months, and really trying to understand, what ideas came forward from those communities. So it's not just Tamarack, it's, what are those good ideas where communities have really moved their work forward. And I think, we're continuing to really think about, the virtual environment. This morning, our team had a conversation about, I think it was maybe you were involved in that conversation earlier, Tom, about how many people have signed up for these big workshops where there are lots of keynote speakers. And they sign up and then they put them in their hold box, and it's again something you never get to, right? You never listen to the speaker, you never download the resource. And so that's interesting for us at Tamarack, because we are delivering virtual workshops and things like that. And the way that we've chosen to do that is to create a more intimate environment, right? So we limit the number of people that are in the course. And we also do a lot of interactive activities, but we also do coaching post, right? So a month after you've taken the course, you have an opportunity to join a group coaching session, and we'll, be one-on-one or one in small groups with you, and really say, okay, so what questions do you have? You came to our program. A month later, how have you used it, or have you used it, or what are you bumping up against, and can we problem solve together? And we found that to be, really the next level of engagement. So while we can't see people face to face, we can still figure out how to engage with them personally. And I think, for those of us that are in organizations like Tamarack, we got to figure that out. We got to, not have, as much as I'd love to, do a half an hour video clip and never engage with anybody, that's not the way that Tamarack works, or not the way that I work. And so we've got to figure out, how do we make it so that people feel like the things that they're learning are making a difference to the organizations and the collaboratives in which they are being and working. And that's, I think, our biggest that's our thinking. That's how our thinking is going right now at Tamarack.
Yeah. So one last question for you.
Sure.
When this is all said and done, we're on the other side of the pandemic. Everybody's got a vaccination. Everybody's healthy. There's no more fear of COVID-19. What will be the permanent change that comes out of the pandemic for change makers?
Whoa, that's a big question. I think we'll have a greater sense of, well, I hope we'll have a greater sense of how we have been able to adapt, right? And I think, one of the things that we have always held to be true at Tamarack is that communities are complex adaptive systems, right? And that you can intervene in a community, but even as you begin to intervene, the community shifts, right? And so that's the Tamarack way of thinking about the world, but it's not necessarily a shared way of thinking about the world, right? Like lots of people will think, okay, they're funding me to do this program, and I'm going to deliver this program the way that I put in my proposal. The funders expect this, and that's the only thing that I'm going to evaluate. We all know the reality is that as you begin to deliver the program, you're learning all the time, and you're adapting and making it real and that kind of thing. And I think, that's something we have to learn even better, right? And hopefully at the end of this, we'll have been able to say, hey, we did these things that were really great, and we shifted, and we were able to shift. And we learned lots of lessons around, we did sense making, and we learned the lessons along the way. So reality is that things are always going to shift, right? Like if it's not COVID, it's going to be something else, right? And whatever that means, it's always happening. It always has happened. How do we become much more adaptive to all of that, And for those of us that like to lean into being more agile and adaptive and emergent, that's great. It's not everybody's preferred mode of operation, right? And so some people will love it. Other people will want to still be in the old way of working or the way that they prefer, which is, I can control this amount of things in my life, right? And other people will be way out in the deep end, pulling us even into more chaotic and emergent zones. But the reality is, I think that we're going to see these shifts happening in one way or other all the time. And the better we get at navigating those shifts, I think the better off we will all be. I don't know if that answered your question, but that's what my hope is.
No, that's a great answer. I really appreciate that. I really do. Well, I know that Thanksgiving is coming for you. And is rugby season over up there yet?
Well, that was an interesting thing. So our team played in the UK, or was going to play in the UK, and the UK was locked down. And so then they said, oh, it will just cost us a lot of money, and we have no home games, and we can't generate any revenue. So they chose not to play this year. So who knows what will happen with rugby, whether they will be invited back next year or not, because it's run by a league in the UK. So yeah, I don't know. It might be a sad repercussion of COVID is that we lose our rugby team,
Ooh, yeah. Let's hope not. Let's hope
not. But it is a reality. And then we've had 3 really good years. So.
Yeah. Well, let's hope that doesn't happen. Well, Liz, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for talking with me about the impact of the pandemic on change making at the community level. It's a tough time that we're all in. It is going to get better. We're going to see changes eventually, but we could be here for a while. And so as long as we're going to be here, we may as well be thinking a little bit differently about how we do things. And you have certainly helped move that conversation forward. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome. I think it is a tough time, but I think it could also be quite a hopeful time as well, right? Because there are opportunities, and I think the challenge will be, how do we lean into those opportunities?